Kabbalah lesson number 6, lesson in Kabbalah number 6. Today we're going to talk about Malchut and Keter. These are very important ones, because these have to do with the foundation of the entire creation. So, we talked last time about the different sefirot, what they represent, what they mean. And we talked about why it is that each of them represents something else, what each of them mean, and how we can relate to them. I don't know if anyone tried. Did anyone try exercising these different emotions, attributes, in different ways? Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet, the different attributes, how they played out. By the way, we got back last night at 3:30 in the morning, so.
Oh my God.
So we talked basically that there are 10 sefirot, and we discussed at length the first 9 of them. The first ones were intellectual ones, Chachma, Bina, Dat. Chachma, which is wisdom, Bina, understanding, Dat, knowledge. Now we're going to skip that middle one, Malchut. Then you have Chesed, kindness, Gevura, strength, beauty, Tiferet, Netzach, victory, splendor, Hod, foundation, Yesod. And we talked about how each of them have different extremes, and you need a balance to bring the two together, and how through that balance you are able to have a proper structure and a proper foundation for each world and each level. So with the 10th and the final sefira is called Malchut. Malchut means kingship. And as you see in the picture, Malchut refers to speech. So we're going to talk about this a little bit, because Malchut is very interesting. It's very diverse, and it stands alone as a very dichotomic. Can you say? Is there such a word? Dichomatous. There is a dichotomy between them. If you take a look and you think about a king, now the problem is that we today in the United States, we don't really have a king per se. We have a president. And a dictator is also not a king. In the world today, there is no real king per se, because either you're elected, either you're in a democratic society where the leader is elected by votes, or it's in a society which is basically a dictatorship. A monarchy is very different. A monarchy is where the people choose the king for the king to be the leader of the people. This was King David and some other great kings throughout history, King Solomon. A king, a true king, is chosen by the people to be a leader of the people, but not a dictator of the people. A leader and a dictator is very different. A leader shows, guides, teaches. A dictator forces. Now, it's not to say that a king doesn't have the power to force. If one stands up against the king, then he has the power to do so. But you need to accept to do the will of the king. In Hebrew, we call it Kabbalat ol, accepting a yoke. Accepting upon yourself that you want to follow the will of the king. Very different than a dictator. In our society, where we live today, so there's an increased self-sufficiency, independence. Everyone wants to claim their own opinion. Everyone wants to claim their own ideas, especially in the generation of the the iPhone, the iPad, the iMac. Everything is about the I. Everybody wants to claim that their ideas are the ones to go, their ideas are the right ways. And sometimes it creates a chaotic state, as we see what's going on today in this country, where you have many different sides and opinions, and each one are trying to fight for their way. But a king is where the people accept upon themselves the king, and the king is the leader of the people. And this if you think about it, is very interesting. Take a look at the first text. The 10th and final sefira is called Malchut. Malchut contains two completely opposite qualities, called hitnasut, meaning exaltedness, and the opposite shiflut, meaning humility. Because on one hand, did you not get a paper? Because on one hand, the king is the greatest. The king is the highest. The king wears the crown. It was said about King Solomon, Mishichmo, V'mayla Gavoa Mikolam, from his shoulders and up, he was higher than everyone else. Yesterday in the airport, we saw a guy who was a basketball player. He must have been at least 7.5 feet. I mean, this guy was tall. But I don't know if King Solomon was actually tall, but his shoulders, meaning that he stood above everyone else. The king stands above everyone else, respected in that sense, in that manner. But at the same time, a king really is nothing. Because without the people, the king is essentially non-existent. So you have these completely opposites, these qualities. On one hand, he's the greatest, higher than everyone else. At the same time, the lowest. Because the king cannot, while being the highest of everyone, but also cannot exist without them. It's essentially nothing without them. If the people do not accept the king as their king, then he's not a king at all. Then he's nothing. If the king wants to survive, how does it have to be? It has to be by taxing the people. He has to rely on the people. Again, we're not talking about a dictator. We're talking about a king, which means that the nation is accepting the king as their leader. So this is where you have this dichotomy about Malchut. Malchut being the highest and the lowest of all the sefirot. And it's for that reason that Malchut sometimes is identified as the highest of the sefirot, and sometimes it's identified as the lowest of the sefirot. And that's why, although you see over here, and you take a look at your picture, there's supposed to be 10 sefirot. How many do you count here? How many are on this page? 11. There's not 11 sefirot. There's only 10. Why? Because sometimes Keter is counted as one of the 10, and sometimes Malchut is counted as one of the 10. because the Malchut essentially has both the Keter, the crown, the highest, the leader, the top, but at the same time, it also is the bottom, the Malchut, the receiver, the one that takes in everything, the one that accepts everything. The one that needs the entire nation in order to be a king. When we talk about God's manifestation of this sefira, so this is what's called Shekhinah. Let's read text number 2. Malchut is the sefira in which the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, becomes manifest within the creation, and it is called Shekhinah. Many of you may have heard the term Shekhinah, but we don't know exactly what it means. Shekhinah means to rest. To rest. The word Shekhinah means to rest, to settle down. When God rests His presence upon the people, it is called the Shekhinah. That is one of the reasons why you need to have 10 men for a minyan. And it's said that at that time when you have those 10 men for the minyan, if you're joining these papers here, then the Shekhinah, which is God's presence, rests upon those 10 people who are praying. Because it is at that time that you have the ability to draw down God's presence, which is essentially an exalted presence, but bring that down into the next level, which is essentially into this world. Now, as we said, each and every world, how many worlds as we count are there? How many worlds do we count that there are? 4. What are the 4 worlds? Atzilot, right? Beriah, Yetzirah,
and
Asiya. Good.
Emanation, creation, formation, and our world.
And action. That's right. Very good. So you have 4 worlds, but essentially what's happening is that in each world, each one is made up of these 10 sefirot, and the final level, which is Malchut of that world, now becomes the Keter, the crown of the next world. In other words, the lowest level of the highest world now becomes the highest level of the next world. Again, let's say that again. The lowest level of the higher world becomes the highest level of the lower world.
So creation is the first world?
The first one is Atzilot, which is emanation. You should have it on one of your papers. I forgot which one it's written down on. Is it class number 2? It's written on your basic one as well.
Okay.
Atzilot, emanation. Bria, creation. Yetzirah, formation. Asiya, action. And these again are general worlds. But each one, you're taking the lowest level of the higher world and it becomes the highest level of the lower world. Because what is essentially happening? Malchut, which is taking together all of the higher sefirot, it's packing it up together and is now bringing it out to the next level. It is for that reason, let's read the next text, that Malchut is also identified with mouth of God or God's speech, for it reveals godliness in the world. What is the idea of Malchut? The way it manifests itself in a physical sense is speech. Because what is speech? Speech is the only thing that really expresses who you are. If you have a feeling, that's an emotion, that's internal. If you have love, if you have fear, you can't really express that. If you want to relate it to something else, even though essentially It's connected to something external, but you cannot relate it to something external without speech. It's also interesting to note that speech is the only thing that is given only to man, only to human beings. No other creation has speech. Because speech, in essence, is the greatest and most powerful tool that we have. Because speech gives the ability to communicate to an outside place, to an outside being, anything outside of you. Speech is where you collect everything that you have, all your emotions, all your thoughts, all your feelings, everything is collected and now brought out into words. Sometimes in a very subtle way, sometimes in a more thought out way, sometimes in a more emotional way. But essentially, speech stands out in that sense of its ability to express oneself beyond any other form of expression. It is also speech that is the only of the 10 sefirot that can only exist with an external being. What I mean to say is, if you have the attribute of love, so you can love something even if it's not really there. You can love something even if it's not clearly in front of you or part of your life. You can be fearful of something that's not in front of you, that's not there, and sometimes not even existent. Right? There's a whole Hollywood business based on people's love and fear, which doesn't even exist. So, most emotions, while they are connected to something outside of you, but they can exist within you. Speech is the only thing that without another being, it's essentially meaningless. I mean, you can talk to the wall. There's an old Yiddish saying, Vent haben Evren, walls have ears too. But essentially speech, the attribute of speech means that you are communicating a message to someone else. And that can only be if there is a someone else for that. The same is true about kingship, which is why it's also called Malchut. A king may be the greatest king, but if there's no nation, the king is non-existent. It can be a powerful man, it can be a great man, it can be a great leader, but if there's no nation, then that king is not a king. So the king needs the nation in order to exist, in order to be who he is. So we have within Malchut, that Malchut is how one connects and relates not only in a emotional way, but an actual relationship, an actual connection, to actually speak, to connect, to communicate with one another. Now, it is also for this reason that in Kabbalistic terms, when it refers to the connection between the 7 sefirot, which is Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, and Malchut, they are referred to in two different ways. You have the first 7, which are called Ze'er Anpin, which means a smaller face. Ze'er Anpin, and it's also 7, the first 6, excuse me. And then you have the 7th one, which is Malchut, and together they're called Zun, also known as Zav and Nukva, which is male and female. Because Malchut is also the ultimate expression of receiving and communicating the message to the next world. And is this reason when there is a communication, whenever there is a union, it's referred to as Za v'Nukva, which is basically, Za stands for Ze'er Anpin, which is referring to the first 6 sefirot, which literally means the small face. It's a Kabbalistic term for the first 6 sefirot, and Malchut. The union, the communion, is constantly what's happening in the realm of the worlds, constant unions between these sefirot and that sefirot, which is usually between the first 6 or the first 9, how you want to look at it, and Malchut. And that is why, in our world as well, anytime you want to talk about something of a reproduction, of a new existence, it always has to be when there is 2 opposites coming together. Zav and Nukva, the male and female. Because it is only at that point when you have the giver referring to the 10 sefirot, or the 6 sefirot, and the Malchut, which is the receiver, can you then bring about a new creation. And it's for that reason that only through the union of male and female that a new creation comes about.
So we're talking now about the flow of energy in the higher world. Is that
Correct.
That's what it is.
Correct.
Right?
We were talking, each sefira has an energy and a keli. So we talked about that each sefira is made up of a light and a vessel. Now we're talking about each one independently, what they represent. And what we're saying is that looking at each one, so you have the 6 sefirot, which represent the 6 different types of attributes, and then those 6 sefirot needs to come together as a union with the Malchut in order to produce or to come to a new level, to a new realm or a new world or whatever it is, and in a physical sense to a new child, to a new being, a new creation. You need to constantly have these 2 opposites coming together. The levels of the first sefirot, that energy coming together, and then communicating that using Malchut, using the level which is the female level, also the kingship level. And that's why Malchut then becomes, again as I said, the Keter, the crown of the next realm, of the next world. Because the lowest level, which is essentially, it's not really the lowest level. The lowest level is really the wrong term. It's the level of communicating to the next realm. That's what it is. Actually, if you look in your picture, you see Malchut is where is actually by the mouth. It's not. Yesod is actually the lowest level. Malchut is the level of communication. It's taking everything that you have, packing that in, and communicating that to the next realm, to the next place, to the next world, to the next person, whatever it may be. It's the level of communication to something outside of you. And as I said, Malchut has these 2 opposite qualities. On one hand, it's the most exalted, because it's able to take everything and relate it to something lower. At the same time, it's humility, because in essence, it's non-existent without everything else. It needs to collect all that energy in order to bring it to the next realm, to the next level. Is this clear or
Yeah, so we have 4 worlds.
right?
So the fourth world, after that will come the fifth world, which would be the messianic. Is that, what is gonna be
The messianic.
yeah.
The messianic.
Is that gonna be the fifth world or?
Oh, it's a little bit of a digression of a topic, but I'll briefly answer it, and at some point we'll talk about it at length. The level of Mashiach, of the messianic level, is not a new level. What Mashiach is revealing in the most physical world, which is the world of Asiya, the godly presence that essentially exists. Because what we've been talking about is how God has to constantly hide His presence more and more. The lower the world, the more He has to hide that existence. Right? And in this world, we live in a world where God's existence is completely hidden, almost. And the idea of Mashiach is revealing God's existence in this physical realm, which is not an easy task. It's taking everything that you do, your physical life, your physical world, and bringing out the godliness within it. Because the godliness exists there. But it's so much hidden that it's something that we can't really relate to. So we have to constantly study and learn, and that's done through doing mitzvahs, through doing Torah and mitzvahs, as God has told us what to do. And through that, we revealed God's presence in this world.
Is there going to be a fifth world?
Those 4 worlds are general worlds, but no, there's not going to be another world. We live in the lowest realm, so to say, which is the realm of Asiya. Even in Asiya, there's different levels. There's a higher level of Asiya, a lower level of Asiya. We live in the lowest realm of Asiya. Again, when we talk about different worlds, so it doesn't actually mean worlds the way we think of. It's not like universes where there's different planets, but it's different dimensions. It's like the example that I gave about sweetness. You know, you could have a sweetness in a candy, you could have a sweetness in music, you could have a sweetness in thought and ideas. So the worlds are different realms of the same idea. It's just a question of how much is God being revealed in each world. But in essence, God really exists the same in all worlds. It's only for the creations of how much they are able to see it. And in this world, we live in a place where God almost completely hides His existence, because this way He's able to put us in a world with free choice and with good and bad, etc., etc. And our job is to reveal the godliness that essentially exists.
Is it that man is sort of blind to God?
God puts man in a way that he needs to search and find God. It doesn't come so easy. God puts us in a world of free choice, and that's our choice. We got to decide what we want to do.
I miss what is the meaning of Beria?
Beria?
Yeah.
Or the translation?
Yes.
Translation is creation. Beria is the first realm of creation, where Atzilut is only in what we translate as an emanation of God's existence. But in other words, it's essentially God Himself, just how it's starting to become revealed to creations, but still it's completely godliness in the world of Atzilut.
And with the knowledge of Kabbalah, we can go to the sixth sense, and we will be in 2 dimensions, even living today.
Well, that's why in the introduction that I gave in the first class, where we talked about one of the reasons that we learned Kabbalah is in order to help us relate to these type of things, so that and that helps us, going back to the point about the Messianic era, that helps us see things in a messianic way, so to speak.
So in this world, we can transcend time and the space. With the
Right.
classic sense.
We begin to realize how the world that we live in a way, transcends time and space.
Yes.
Even while we are living in a world of time and space. Okay. Oh wait, when is the solar eclipse? Did that happen already?
Monday,
Monday.
21st,
Monday morning, early?
afternoon, here in the afternoon, 1 o'clock, 1:15 to 2:45.
Mm-hmm. There's the solar eclipse. The reason I'm asking is because the solar eclipse has a lot of meaning in Kabbalah as well. We talked about the sun, how the sun is a metaphor for God, and the idea of the solar eclipse is the moon, and the moon represents Malchut. Why? Because the sun is the light that's shining, and Malchut is completely a receiving vessel. See how everything is connected? At nighttime, what happens when you see the moon? The light of the moon is not really light of a moon. What is it? It's a reflection of the sun. In other words, it's the sun giving off through the moon for people to receive it in a, I guess, in a lighter way or an easier way. And so the moon represents Malchut, because when you have nothing of its own, only what's being given over by another in order to shine from there, that is the representation of Malchut.
Like the king, who has nothing without the
Like a king.
acquiescence.
Exactly, like the king, which the job of the king is to reign on the people, but only when there is something given to him. That's the sun. The sun is the light, is the energy reflecting on the moon. That's one of the reasons why the moon represents the Jewish people. Because the sun reflects on the moon, and the Jewish people are only shining that light. Which the Jewish people, in essence, the same thing, that the sun, the metaphor of God, is shining to the people, to the Jewish people, and we in turn are shining off, or giving off that light which we are receiving as the moon. So this plays out in many different ways. And so what happens when there's a solar eclipse is you then have the moon, which is the level of Malchut, then showing its true kingship, its true sovereignty, even over the sun, which is something that's very unique, that doesn't always happen. But only since you came to this Kabbalah class, you will know the true meaning of what the solar eclipse actually means.